Today you are going to start in lab right after fall break as well. Does that make sense? So you're going to start in lab right after fall break. The hard stuff that you're going to do in that lab right after fall break, we will also cover in lecture before you're tested on it in lab, like the brain stuff. The brain stuff is pretty hard, but this set of notes doesn't really have that much brain stuff in it. It's the next one. Okay, so I want to talk about the nervous system, and I want to talk about CNS and PNS like we did last time. And so this picture right here is a pretty cool picture of the human nervous system all stretched out. And this isn't every nerve in your body. This is only the big ones. The nerves even branch further and further and further. But what you will see is that every single nerve in your body can be traced back to the central nervous system. Can you see that? Think of them like highways going all the way out to somebody's driveway in Panguitch. You still have to be able to get all the way back to I-15, right? So no matter how many turns you have to take to get there, every single sensation that you have has to end up in the central nervous system. And every single activity that is controlled from the central nervous system. So this picture is showing you both the CNS and the PNS, yes? Do you guys remember what structures are contained within the central nervous system? You should, yeah? It's just the brain and the spinal cord, right? So let's talk about the brain and the spinal cord right here. So the brain and the spinal cord, we're going to do these in more detail in the next set of notes because they actually take quite a bit of time to master, and it's not going to be on your second test, it's on your third test. Okay, the brain and the spinal cord, of course the brain's in the cranial cavity like we talked about, and the spinal cord is in the spinal or vertebral cavity. Note to self, the spinal cord actually ends way higher than you expect it to. It ends about L1 or L2, which is just below your last two ribs, right? Two below your last two ribs. And so the spinal cord ends way higher. Now you still have nervous tissue that is in the vertebral canal after that, but it's PNS tissue, not CNS tissue. And that matters. Have you ever wondered why when they do epidural injections or do a spinal tap, they do it way down low instead of up high? What if I accidentally poked something? Would you rather accidentally poke CNS tissue or PNS tissue? PNS tissue, right? CNS tissue is where most of your neurons are, your cell bodies, and so those are mostly amitotic. If you damage them, the likelihood of getting any regeneration is pretty low, right? If you damage PNS tissue, the likelihood of regeneration is not zero. It's definitely not 100% either, but it's something between 0 and 100%. Okay. So you've got your CNS tissue, which is your brain and your spinal cord. So let's just talk briefly about what the brain and spinal cord are made of, and then we're going to get into it in detail in the next set of notes. The majority of the brain and the spinal cord is composed of, I know you've heard the terms gray matter and white matter before, yes? Okay, so here's some gray matter and white matter. This is a fresh brain. When the brain is fresh, just taken out of the body, this is immediately post-mortem. It's actually not gray, it's pink, because it's got a lot of capillary flow to it, okay? But can you see the difference between the gray matter, yes, right here, and then the white matter, okay? So we're going to get into this in quite a bit of detail, but the gray matter is where most of your neurons, the cell bodies for those are. So think about it this way. The gray matter is really where all the processing goes on. It's like where your circuit boards are. What is the white matter? The white matter is the wiring between the two portions that process. Does that make sense? So the wiring is really just connecting one portion of gray matter to the other. This is a space-filling model I'm about to show you of the white matter of the brain, which is really freaking cool. I love this picture. So the white matter of the brain, imagine all the gray matter was taken off. What they did is they made a space-filling model that shows where all the wiring comes from and goes to in the brain. You can kind of see that all of these cables, like for instance, here's your frontal cortex and here's your occipital cortex, and you could, for instance, connect something you see with something that you think. Yes? By going from one portion to the other. You've also got wiring that goes from left side to right side, wiring that goes from up to down, from back to front. Does that make sense? So if you look at your brain, again, what the brain tends to look like is gray matter on the outside, white matter in the middle, connecting all the gray matter. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so the brain also has a completely different texture than anybody ever expects. The brains that you will get to see in lab, you get to see a whole bunch of human brains in lab, but they're all preserved. And they are preserved because that tissue is so very fatty. It's almost all fat and protein. It will desiccate almost instantaneously and start to degenerate almost instantaneously unless we inject it immediately post-mortem with almost 100% formaldehyde. And we do that in the cadavers by injecting it right here all the way up into the brain. That brain, always use gloves when you're handling material, but especially with the brain, because it's straight formaldehyde in there, which is not going to kill you, but it doesn't feel good on your hands, right? So why do we do that? Because when I hold a fresh brain, the fresh brain just starts to slide off the edges of my hands, like holding a bag of pudding, right? It just completely slides off the edge. And I know it sounds really gross when you're talking about humans, but if you ever get the chance to hold a fresh brain from any organism, right? Whether it's a freaking chicken, whether it's a deer, whether it's a human, do it. Because you will get an appreciation for the texture that you actually have. And when we do the brain in the next set of notes, we're going to watch like an immediate post-mortem so that you can actually see the texture of the human brain. So it's really, really squishy. The ones that you have are preserved so that they actually hold their shape at all, but they are not at all like that in your head. Just to bring that home, they're so squishy that, for instance, if this person had been alive and had had a tumor, they actually don't even need to use sharp instruments in order to do brain surgery. They can just use suction. You can suck out a little chunk. So it's so squishy that you can just suck it out. So anyway, it's gray matter and white matter. So let's talk about the gray matter is primarily made of tissue like this. Let me show you. So if I looked at the gray matter of the brain, it is primarily made of neurons and their supporting glial cells, and it usually has a really rich blood supply to it. Okay, so we're going to get into that in more detail later. So gray matter has the neuron cell bodies. Okay, white matter is really just wiring going to and from. And white matter within the brain is called a tract or pathway. And so this is what it looks like within the brain, tract or pathway. But white matter within the peripheral nervous system is actually called a nerve. So can you see that what I am actually seeing here is a bunch of cables? So what a nerve is it's a bunch of wiring that's going to and from the central nervous system. So if I do this, the information goes up through the nerve so that I can have sensation of it. And if I do this, it has to come out from the nerve. But where are all the neurons, the actual neuron cell bodies? They're protected in the central nervous system. Does that make sense? The central nervous system is where they're protected. Anybody want to hypothesize as to why the neuron cell bodies are almost all in the central nervous system as opposed to being just scattered out here? Why?
So they can send the signal.
So they can send the signal, and then what's special about them that makes you really need to protect them? They don't regenerate, yes? So what I have out here, yes, is just wiring going to and from a more precious portion, which is in here. Does that make sense? Okay. So what a nerve is really just a bundle of processes that are sticking off of neurons and axons that are elsewhere. And we're going to see those in just a second. So in the central nervous system, gray matter, white matter. The white matter is called tracts or pathways, and we're going to get back to those when we do the next set of notes. Every single sensation that you have has to go to the central nervous system for integration, right? So hand on a hot stove, the information has to come to the central nervous system for integration. You are only aware of it if it goes to a specific portion of your brain. You only have conscious awareness of a sensation if it goes to the most superficial 4 millimeters of your brain called the cerebral cortex. Everything else you have no conscious awareness of at all, okay? So there's a whole lot going on without you even knowing about it. Every single motor command to wiggle or squirt anything in your body will come from the central nervous system, but you're only in voluntary control of a single tissue. And what was that? Skeletal muscle, Okay, so although we are doing tons of sensation and tons of motor activity, we are not really involved in very much of it. Okay, so we're going to come back to the central nervous system in the whole next set of notes, but for today we're going to focus on the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is actually a little simpler, although the terminology gets a little sticky. Okay, so all of the other nervous tissue in the body that is not brain or spinal cord is PNS, or peripheral nervous system. And let's go back just again and look at this picture for just a second. So all of this stuff that's kind of the yellower color, that's all PNS. And most of it, again, is just wiring to and from the CNS, with the exception of a few little blobs right here called ganglia. Ganglia are where you have a little blob of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. There aren't very many compared to how many cell bodies you have inside the central nervous system. And so we'll cover their function a little bit later. But the rest of the PNS is all just nerves. So I want to show you what a nerve is and start you guys understanding it. So this is the biggest nerve in the body right here, called the sciatic nerve. Okay, sciatic nerve is a huge honker. It runs down the back of your leg. If you can't find it in a cadaver, you should probably flunk, because it's like so big. So the sciatic nerve is ginormous and runs down the back of your leg. So if I took a cross section of the sciatic nerve, I want to see what it would actually look like. Cross section of the sciatic nerve would look like this. Okay, what it is bundle after bundle after bundle of the axons for neurons that are not actually in the nerve. Okay, so for this one, do you see that axon that's labeled at the top? Yeah? The neuron for that axon, my sciatic nerve runs down the back of my leg. The neuron cell body for that axon might be up here in the lumbar region of my spinal cord. You with me? Okay, and the axon is going to run through, all the way through, and innervate the muscle in my little toe. Does that make sense? But the cell body is not in the nerve, right? The cell body is protected elsewhere. Does that make sense? There's another axon running through there, not labeled, that is attached to a sensory receptor in my little toe, so I could tickle my toe. That axon runs all the way up the sciatic nerve to communicate in, right? So a nerve is a bundle of axons, right, that is communicating to and from the central nervous system. So kind of like a coaxial cable. Do you know what a coaxial cable is? It's a cable made of wires, or a wire made of wires, right? Okay, so what this nerve is a bundle of myelinated axons that's protected by 3 different layers of connective tissue, and it has the same kind of pattern that you learned before in the muscular system. So watch. The entire nerve, this is the sciatic nerve right here, the entire nerve is wrapped in connective tissue called epineurium. Yes? And is composed of multiple bundles of axons. Each bundle is called a fascicle. Yes? And a fascicle is wrapped in connective tissue called perineurium. Yes? And is composed of multiple axons. Yeah, this time it's not a muscle fiber. That's what it was with muscles, but it's an axon. Each axon is wrapped in connective tissue called endoneurium. Exactly. And where is the neuron that goes to this axon? Either up there or down there, right? But it's definitely not in the nerve, right? So let's think about what that means. That means that in this picture right here, if I damaged right here the sciatic nerve, right? Do I actually have complete paralysis of this leg? No, I don't, right? Because the neuron cell bodies are all the way up here, guys. I didn't kill off the neuron. Could I damage the sciatic nerve and maybe 2 years in the future regain innervation and functionality? Yeah, because the cell is still alive. Does that make sense? So the neurons are up there protected in the central nervous system. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so here's something that I want to caution you against, and you won't have time to think about it until very deeply until after your lab practical. What people try to do with the nervous system, because the terminology is really unfamiliar to a lot of people, is they try to use the term nerve and neuron and sometimes axon interchangeably, but you can't use those. Because a nerve is a big bundle of axons. Each axon may be doing something different, right? So you can't use them interchangeably. And a nerve is also not a neuron, right? The neuron is an individual cell. So what I want to tell you is I want you to listen as I am using it, right, and hear how I distinguish nerve from neuron from axon. And then once you guys finally get a quiz, which you will get as a take-home quiz next Monday, because I don't want to give you guys one when you're studying for your lab practical, but I'm going to give you a take-home one next Monday that you'll take with you over fall break. Yes, don't complain that I gave you quiz over fall break. I'm going to ask you some questions that make you distinguish between them, right? And if you don't distinguish, you'll get them wrong, but getting things wrong is part of the learning experience, right? Okay, so nerve, neuron, axon. You can't use them interchangeably. Okay, so let's talk about the nerves that exist in the body. You ready? Okay, so as far as the nerves that exist in the body, there are tons of nerves in the body. But every single nerve, again, has to be tracked back to I-15, right? So there are a limited number of on-ramps and off-ramps to the central nervous system. Yes, there's a finite number of on-ramps and off-ramps. Every single sensation that you have, in order to ever do anything about it, it has to make it back up onto I-15. Yes? Okay, so the on-ramps and off-ramps to the nervous system are either attached directly to the brain. The ones that are attached directly to the brain are called cranial nerves. Yes? There are 12 pairs of those. You're not learning them in this set of notes, but you will learn them in the next one. Okay, 12 pairs of cranial nerves. You will also learn them in the next lab that you do after your lab practical. They are Roman numerals 1 through 12. And then they each have individual names based on where they go or what they do, like the optic nerve is for vision, right? The hypoglossal nerve goes under your tongue. Does that make sense? Okay, so you will learn structure and function of those a little bit later, but not in this set of notes. I just want to tell you the 12 cranial nerves. 12 cranial nerves, to oversimplify, mostly what they do is control head sensation, yeah? So like hearing goes through a cranial nerve, vision goes through a cranial nerve. You guys with me? But they also control head motor activity. Everything from salivary gland secretion, right, to wiggling my facial muscles. Mostly controlled through my cranial nerves. You got that? Okay, so that's an oversimplification. There's an exception to it, but it's mostly cranial nerves do head stuff. And then these that come directly off of your spinal cord are called spinal nerves. And spinal nerves do the rest of the body stuff, mostly, yeah? But let's simplify. We'll have to add a little bit more detail to it now, but I want to tell you what the spinal nerves kind of do. And then later on, we'll add more detail. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. They don't all have individual names based on what they do. They just are labeled for where they come out of the spinal cord. Like you've got T1 through T12 spinal nerves, right? Okay, so this is an oversimplification, but it's a good place to start. The cervical spinal nerves that come out right here mostly do arm stuff. Yeah, sensation and motor activity in the arms, yes? The ones that come out the middle mostly do torso stuff, yeah? The ones that come out the lumbar region do leg stuff and junk. Legs and junk. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk about spinal cord injuries. I'm sure that there's a lot that I can learn about spinal cord injuries, and hopefully Kirsty is going to teach me as we go through. So when you know this already, right? You guys know that the higher the spinal cord injury, the more loss of functionality that you have. Can you see why now? Right? So if you were Christopher Reeve, what did he have? C4? C3? Yeah, he was a quad. So Christopher Reeve had a spinal cord injury all the way up here. He had complete loss of sensory and motor innervation of his lower limbs. He had a little bit of sensation left in his arms because I think there were still a few fibers coming through here. Does that make sense? If you damage it further down, yes, a person who damages it way down here, are you going to lose sensory and motor innervation of your upper limbs? No, you're not going to lose sensory and motor innervation of your upper limbs. You are going to lose it of your lower limbs. Does that make sense? Okay, and your genitalia. So the lower the spinal cord injury, the less loss of sensation and motor activity. That makes sense? So higher spinal cord injuries are more likely to, for instance, damage your capacity for respiration and voluntary movement, all that kind of stuff. Good? Okay, so That's just an intro. We're actually going to do spinal nerves in more detail in the next set of notes. Okay, so you've got 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Every single other nerve in the body has to be tracked back to a cranial nerve or a spinal nerve, or else it will never get the information to and from the central nervous system, right? Does that make sense? Okay, all right, so do you guys have questions? Anybody have questions? Okay, I don't believe you. Okay, so what we are going to do now is going to try to learn some terminology and ask as many questions as you want. We're going to do some examples with this stuff. In my experience, one of the reasons that people have difficulty with the nervous system is because you came into this class knowing that this was the femur and that that was the deltoid, right? And you know a decent amount of baseline information about other body systems, but the terminology of the nervous system is usually new. So you need to be critical about your understanding as we're going through. And again, my request to you is ask your question when you have it, not 15 minutes after, so that I can redirect. And I bet somebody has the same question anyway, and it may not occur to me. Okay, so what we are going to do is we're going to look at the functional organization of the nervous system. We're going to learn some functional terminology. And first, we're going to start with the big picture understanding of the nervous system, and we're going to say, here's a question for you, ready? Okay, I've got the CNS and the PNS, yes? First question, one-way or two-way communication between CNS and PNS? One-way or two-way? Two-way, yeah? Okay, so I'm going to draw two arrows, and then I'm going to continue asking you questions as we go through this. If I labeled one of those arrows, top or bottom, sensory, which arrow would get the label sensory? Which arrow would get the label sensory? Top one. Do you see why? If you don't, somebody explain it. Why is the top one sensory?
Because it's carrying the sensation to the brain.
Yes, carrying information to the central nervous system. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the bottom one gets the label usually motor, which is the response, controlling motor activity. Okay. So if peripheral nervous system carries information to the central nervous system sends it out back through the peripheral nervous system. What happens inside the central nervous system? Any idea? Yeah, it's the processing. Do you remember the word for that?
Integration.
Integration, yes. Okay. That means that, with very few exceptions, the central nervous system itself is not actually sensing anything. There's actually no sensory receptors in your brain. So that's why they can do brain surgery, like the person's wide awake and they're poking in their brain. It doesn't feel anything. It doesn't have any sensory receptors. For that matter, the brain is not directly the cells of the brain are not directly attached to muscles or glands either. So the brain does not wiggle or squirt any other cells, right? So what it is primarily doing is just the processing that's necessary for understanding sensation that occurred elsewhere and controlling motor activity that will occur elsewhere. Does that make sense? So if we do hand on a hot stove again, the information comes through the peripheral nervous system for sensation, gets integrated in the central nervous system, gets sent back out for motor activity so you can move your hand. Good? Okay. So that's the relationship between the CNS and the PNS. Now, of course, this is complicated as all hell, right? We're not doing this in this set of notes. We're going to come back in the next set of notes and pick up the whole CNS, the brain structure, okay? So for right now, we're going to concentrate on this part, which is the peripheral nervous system, where we're going to look at the functionality of the peripheral nervous system, like what it's doing. Here's what it's almost never doing, integration. It is really primarily doing sensation and motor activity, right? Okay. Integration goes on in the neurons, which are mostly in the CNS. Yes? So the decision about what the sensation means and what motor response should follow is not happening out here. It's happening in here. Good? Okay. So what we are going to do now is we are going to further subdivide the peripheral nervous system. There's a figure in your textbook that does this, but you'll understand it way the hell better if you do it yourself. So put this up here for just a second. So we are going to divide the peripheral nervous system into, so the peripheral nervous system is either going to be doing sensation or motor activity, okay? So there's new words that you need to learn. Sensation is either called sensory or there's a ferent word, afferent. The sensory or afferent division of the peripheral nervous system sends information to the central nervous system. Got it? Where does it pick up information from? From sensory receptors. Okay, so let's talk about sensation and sensory receptors for just a second. So you have sensory receptors a whole bunch of places. When you were in kindergarten, you learned your 5 special senses. Do you remember? Anybody have little kids because they still learned them, right? Just recently. You learned hearing, right? Vision, smell, taste. The other one's balance, equilibrium, although sometimes kids don't learn that one. Sometimes they pretend it's touch, but that's not actually a special sense. So those are your special senses. And then you have your general senses. Your general senses are all the ones that you don't usually think of. Touch, pressure, heat, cold, pain, stretch, all of those kinds of things. Now, all of these, you have the capacity to detect changes in the internal and external environment because you have receptors for those kinds of changes. Now, you can't do anything about it unless you send that information to the central nervous system, right? So these are sensory receptors, but depending on where the sensory receptor is, it's going to be further subdivided into 2 different types of sensation. You ready? Okay. The 2 types of sensation that you can encounter, and we're going to practice this with a couple of examples in just a second. I have somatic sensory. This is for receptors, sensory receptors in skin, muscle, and bone. Mostly things that are relatively close to the surface. Okay? But I have other kinds of sensations. So tickling, yeah, on your skin, that's a somatic sensation. Uterine cramps, not a somatic sensation. Not occurring on skin, muscle, and bones, occurring in your guts. So that is what we call visceral sensation, or visceral sensory. So, you know the term visceral means guts, yes? Right? So for instance, what about your stomach growling because you're hungry? Right? Okay? Or your stomach hurting because you ate something bad. That's a visceral sensation, right? Somebody punches you in the kidneys. That's a visceral sensation. Tickling, burning your skin. Those are what kind of sensations? Somatic sensations. Okay, so the somatic sensation is part of the afferent division of the peripheral nervous system, and we're going to practice this in just a second. So we've got somatic and visceral sensations, and then we have motor activity, and this is going to have a subdivision as well. And then we're going to practice with a couple of examples. The other division of the peripheral nervous system is called motor or efferent. Now, the ferent words you have to learn. Now would be a great time to learn them. I am mispronouncing them, by the way, so you can hear the difference. They're actually afferent and efferent, but it doesn't sound very different when I say that. So I texticize them and say afferent and efferent. Don't say that in front of smart people. How do you remember which one is which? One of my students told me that she thought that afferent approaches the central nervous system and efferent exits the central nervous system. If that works for you, that's great. If you have a better one, share. Okay? So I've got the motor or efferent division, and the motor or efferent division has a further subdivision. Okay? Where it is going to, this starts from sensory receptors. This ends up at what we call effectors. That is not a term that most people know yet. An effector is something upon which you can effect a change. You can make it do something. Effectors wiggle and squirt. That's how you can remember. So it'll be all the types of muscles plus gland, right? Okay. So if effectors. So this is going to have a further subdivision. You ready? You're going to have the somatic motor division of the efferent nervous system, and the effector is going to be skeletal muscle. And we're about to practice this, so it'll start to stick in just a second. Okay? This, by the way, guys, is very often called the voluntary division of the nervous system because it's the only one you can control voluntarily. Got it? Okay, and then this one over here is called the autonomic, or sometimes visceral, motor division. And it will go to, what other tissues can you wiggle or squirt, even if not voluntarily, besides skeletal muscle? Go ahead. What did you say? No, tissue. What? Tissue. Tissues. We've got skeletal muscle. What else can we wiggle or squirt? Cardiac muscle, got it. What else? Smooth muscle. What squirts? Glands. But you can't control those voluntarily. So that's an involuntary division. All right, so because this doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot to you, we're going to do a couple of examples and force you guys to use this terminology and see what we're talking about. You ready? Okay, we're going to do 2 examples. We're going to go back to my original example of hand on a hot stove. Okay, and the response that occurs after I put my hand on a hot stove. You ready? So listen to the questions and I want you guys to engage. Okay, I put my hand on a hot stove. Yes? Which side do I start on? Sensory or motor? Sensory. What's the other afferent word for sensory? Afferent. Afferent, exactly. Afferent, afferent. It's actually afferent. So, sensory or afferent, right? Which branch? The somatic sensory. Tell me why you know that. Skin, yes. So it is a somatic sensation, right? So the sensation goes up the somatic sensory division of the what ferrent nervous system? Afferent nervous system, which is part of what? The PNS or CNS? PNS. To the CNS to do what? Integration, yes. Okay, but I haven't taken care of the problem yet. All I did was send it in, and my brain is now going, hot, how hot, too damn hot? Okay, now I need to send it back out. You ready? I'm going to respond. So I'm going to send it out through what? CNS or PNS? Send it out through the PNS, yes. Okay, which side do I go down now? Use the ferrent word. Efferent. I go out the efferent division. And what tissue am I trying to control? Skeletal muscle. So which branch do I go out? Somatic motor. Don't say somatic, you have to say motor because you've got 2 somatics. Somatic motor, yes. To what effector? What is the effector tissue? Skeletal muscle is the effector. Yes? Does that make sense? So skeletal muscle is the effector that I just controlled. Okay? You ready? Okay, so now we're going to do another one. We're going to do a totally different kind of stimulus response situation, and you guys are going to start to get confident with it. And then you're going to come up with one of your own. Okay? So this next one is me going to eat Thai food at Shannon Thai. And I was not raised with spicy Thai food, and I think I can eat a 5, and I cannot eat a 5 without repercussions. The repercussions of me eating a spice level of 5 of Thai food are going to be that Melanie gets the squirts. Right? You ready? So let us talk about that particular situation. Which side am I going to start on? Which ferrent side? I'm going to start over here, yes? And what kind of sensation am I going to have? Visceral sensory, because why? Because it disturbed, right? My guts, right? The wall of my intestines are being severely disturbed by my lack of decision-making skills. So, visceral sensation, which goes up the what ferrent division? Afferent division of the CNS or PNS? PNS to the CNS for integration. This time, instead of hot, how hot, too damn hot, it's spicy. How spicy? Too damn spicy. Yes? And then you are going to send that information back out, CNS or PNS, out the PNS. Where does it go? Which side? Motor, efferent, yes. Okay, now where? Autonomic motor to end up where? Not my cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle, so I can give myself the squirts to get out of them, right? So smooth muscle is the effector. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is the terminology that you guys are going to need to get comfortable using. You never stop using the afferent words ever. They follow you all the way through anatomy, all the way through physiology. Can you guys come up with your own example? I'll help guide you through it if you come up with your own example. Step on a nail. Okay, let's do it. What are you going to do in response? We have to decide what the response is. Are you going to cry, or are you going to move your leg, or what? You're going to lift your foot up. Okay, step on a nail, lift your foot up. Where do we start, guys? We start at somatic sensory. Again, tell me why. Why we know it's somatic sensory. Because it's your skin and it's sensation in your skin. Yes? Somatic sensory division of the what afferent? Afferent nervous system, which is part of the PNS or CNS. Part of the PNS. Sends the information to the CNS for what purpose? Integration. Okay? And then you decide, consciously or subconsciously, doesn't even matter, that you are going to respond because you said, sharp, how sharp? 2 times sharp. And you send it back out, right? CNS or PNS? PNS. Which afferent? Efferent, yes. And if I'm going to move my leg, I'm going to go somatic motor to what effector? Skeletal muscle. What if, in addition, I also cried? So the sensation was the same. The motor response is different. Can you get me to cry? I'm going to do efferent, right? But where am I going to end up? Autonomic, because I'm going to end up at a gland. Yeah? Do you exclusively have to do one response? No. You can do a bunch if you want to. It's hard to look at them all at the same time, but you can do a bunch. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. Questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So we actually learned about this in my physiology
Yeah.
class today, and we were discussing that that you have a reflex associated with this type of thing, stepping on a nail, and then
Yes.
you have that reflex. So when it's a reflex,
Yeah.
which
The only real difference is that this doesn't go to the smart portions of your brain. The integration for a reflex either happens in someplace really dumb and automatic, like the brainstem, or someplace really dumb and automatic, like the spinal cord.
That's right. Reflex doesn't go to the brain at all.
No, it does. It just doesn't go to the smart portions of your brain. Okay, the smart conscious portions of your brain that are making intellectual decisions are like the cerebral cortex. But a reflex needs to be faster than that, right? So a reflex would go to brainstem or to spinal cord and right back out. And a reflex is not complex processing. It's just stimulus response, right? It still gets integrated. It just doesn't get consciously integrated. Because conscious integration, does it make sense to you that if you involve 100,000 neurons, it's going to be a slower response, right? And sometimes getting something done quickly is really the thing that's most important. So if something's coming at my face, do I need to process and think about what's coming at my face, or do I need to move my freaking face away, right? Does that make sense? So that's a reflex. And reflexes are still integrated. They still are in the same story, but the integration portion that you're using is going to be a relatively simple stimulus response part of the central nervous system. Did you have a comment?
Oh, I was just going to say, like, you don't have to anything yes or
No,
no.
exactly. So if it's truly a reflex, then it's really going to be way faster than a cerebral response. Does that make sense? Okay, but it's still the same story. Go ahead.
So then where does that fall? It seems like it would fall somewhere between somatic and autonomic.
No, the somatic and autonomic only has to do with the tissue that you're controlling. So if it's a cardiac response, it's autonomic, right? If it's a skeletal muscle response, it's somatic, okay? We usually think of this, that's why I said when I put a star here, I said we usually think of that as the voluntary division. But are you always in voluntary control of your skeletal muscle? No, with reflexes, it happens without you really giving permission or even having the capacity to deny permission. So this is the only tissue that you can ever control voluntarily, but you can't always control it voluntarily, right? So something comes at my face, I move my head. It was all happening way faster than voluntary conscious control. It was still, however, somatic. It still was somatic. Okay, so we're going to add just a teeny bit of detail to this. This will go right under here. Okay, if you have room. If you don't, you can do it the way that I did it, which is I'm going to blow it up over here. And this is stuff that you talk about in a ton of detail in physiology. I want to introduce you to it. We will go into a little bit more detail about it in the next set of notes. But I want to tell you that the autonomic motor division has a further subdivision. Okay, so you can put it over there if you've got room. If not, you can just draw it separately. So the autonomic motor division, again, is still going to end up at the same effectors. And the effectors are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Okay? But there is a further subdivision. You ready? The further subdivision is the sympathetic branch, or sometimes division, it doesn't really matter which term you use, and the parasympathetic branch. So give me a second to explain what these do. And if you don't get it the first time, you are not alone. These are going to go to the same tissue. So before I go any further, what I'm going to tell you about this is that if I'm wiring my nervous system up to skeletal muscle, I only have one wire. And I either turn it on and cause it to contract or just leave it the hell alone. Okay? So basically, skeletal muscle just has one nervous system hookup. But with the heart, you have two. Because with the heart, for instance, you can actively stimulate the heart or you can actively inhibit it. You can turn it up, gas pedal. You can turn it down, brakes. Yes? So with all of these organs, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, instead of having one hookup that you just turn on or leave alone, you can actively turn your heart up. It can go up to around 200 beats per minute. You can actively turn it down, right? Okay. So you can do that with these tissues. So they have what we call dual innervation, right? Two sets of wiring to these tissues. And the sympathetic branch is very often called the fight or flight branch. And that's when you're going to use it. Talk about it in just a second. The parasympathetic branch is very often called the feed or breed branch. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of examples of these kinds of things. So let's start with the heart, because everybody can kind of figure out what the heart should do under emergency situations or non-emergency situations. Let's start with that, okay? So what's happening with you guys right now is right now there's not a tiger in the room and you don't even have a test. So what you are probably doing is actively inhibiting your heart from going above, say, 60 to 80 beats per minute, right? So you actually have your foot on the brakes right now. The parasympathetic nervous system has your foot on the brakes, okay? And why? Because you don't really need it to. You don't need it to go higher, right? So, but what's going to happen if a tiger walks in the room? Tigers are, exactly. But remember what you're going to do first is you're going to take your foot off the brake, right? And that's going to allow the heart rate to go up a little bit, but not enough for a freaking tiger, right? So now you are going to put your foot on the gas, yes? And you're going to increase stimulation to the same tissue. Does that make sense? Okay. That's what the sympathetic nervous system would do. Now, so the sympathetic nervous system increases the activity of cardiac muscle because that would be helpful for a fight or flight situation. Does everybody agree? Yeah? But do I need to increase the activity of all tissues in fight or flight situations? So let's do the same kind of example, but this time I want to think about the smooth muscle that is in the wall of your digestive system. Okay? So I want you guys to think about what's going on before the tiger walks in the room. Right now, you may have just eaten lunch, right? Okay? And your digestive system, which branch do you think is in control right now? Parasympathetic, but what do you think it's doing to the smooth muscle in your wall of your digestive system right now? No, it's not pushing it down, right? Because you can afford to digest your food right now, right? So the parasympathetic nervous system is actively stimulating your digestive system right now. And why? Because there's no tiger in the room. It's the time that you could afford to do that, right? And now a tiger walks into the room. Do you need to spend ATP on digesting your lunch? No, because if the tiger eats you, he can digest your lunch for himself. Yes? Okay? So what's going to happen is the parasympathetic nervous system was actively inhibiting cardiac muscle right now and actively stimulating smooth muscle, right? Tiger walks into the room, turn that damn thing off, turn this branch on, right? And what does it do to cardiac muscle? Increase it. What does it do to everything non-essential? Decrease it. Does that make sense? So where students very often make a mistake is they get in the habit of thinking that the sympathetic nervous system increases the activity of all tissues. But that wouldn't make sense because you have to think about resource allocation, right? What would help, right? What would help you in that situation? Send more nutrients, more activity to tissues that could be helpful. Decrease nutrients and activity of tissues that couldn't help. Does that make sense? Okay. So what happens with the dual innervation is that you use these in fight or flight, you use these in feed or breed, and then how do you figure out what increases and what decreases? You logic your way through it. But we'll work on that when we get to the next one. Just a second, Alice. So my physiology professor was in the habit of telling me that the autonomic nervous system controlled the 4Fs. Fight, flight, feed, and breed. Yes? That's what it controls. Autonomic nervous system. Got it? Alice, go ahead.
So what if you're not, this is where I get confused because fight or flight, that's like a total emergency situation. And so your blood pressure is going to go
Yes.
up, your heart rate is going to go up,
Yes.
and then the non-essential things will kind of slow down. But then what if you're not in an emergency situation, but you are, let's say, exerting yourself, you're doing hard labor, you're running, whatever.
Oh, okay. So that's a good question. So you could also say fight, flight, and exercise. The sympathetic branch also works during exercise. So it doesn't have to be an emotional emergency or like a blow. If I need my cardiac muscles to increase because I'm working out, then it does that too. So it's fight, flight, and exercise.
So anytime that we're doing something that's going to increase our heart rate, increase our blood pressure,
Mm-hmm.
you can pretty much say that the parasympathetic branch is going to decrease in activity.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So you're going to take your foot off the brakes, right, for instance, your heart, and you're going to put your foot on the gas for your heart. Does that make sense? Okay. Got it? Okay, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh.
Kirsty.
I was just wondering about like panic attacks.
Okay, so the panic attacks are really interesting. So I'm a really anxious, spazzy person. You probably never noticed, though. I'm sure it's really, really well hidden. What a panic attack is this gets turned on, but there wasn't a tiger. But does it matter whether there wasn't a tiger? It doesn't, right? What happens is it gets turned on without the same stimulus that would turn it on for him. And if we want to be compassionate and empathetic to other people, we can acknowledge that every single person in this room has a trigger for panic or anxiety that does not apply to the person next to them, right? But once you turn on the physiology is identical. Does that make sense? So, and we talk about this in physiology quite a bit. We talk about the stress response and that there are things that you can do about that stress response. One of them is change your interpretation through, for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy. So why the hell does going to a therapist sometimes work for instance, panic attacks and anxiety? Yeah, you reframe your thinking. So if you can take a trigger from being something that activates your sympathetic nervous system to something that is less likely to activate your sympathetic nervous system, then you will not get the same physiological responses, right? So you can either, right? So if I go to my therapist and I tell her that I'm just generally crazy and I would like to be slightly less crazy or crazy in a more useful way, and she's like, what are you afraid of? I'm like, I'm afraid of ending up homeless on the street. And she's like, okay, so what could cause that to occur? Well, I could lose my job, end up homeless. My husband could leave me. She's like, well, what would be the worst thing that would happen in this situation? She's like, oh, well, you probably lose your house, but you might lose your job. But could you get another job? Yeah, I could get another job. Could you like do without your husband? Yeah, totally. Yeah, sure. Might not be as good a job or as nice a house, but do you think you're actually with 3 degrees going to end up homeless on the street? Well, probably not, really, right? So we just continue to talk about it until I'm slightly less crazy at the other end. And so the next time I think about the same stressful situation, right, then I have less of a physiology response. But it's still probably going to be a relatively minor sympathetic nervous system response. Or if you think about not just crazy, but also training. So why would I, if somebody holds a gun on me, not have the same massive sympathetic nervous system response or have a more massive sympathetic nervous system response as a cop in inner city Chicago would have under the same circumstances? Why do I have a more massive sympathetic nervous system response than he does? What?
You're not used to that response, whereas they've trained to recognize
Precisely,
that.
right? So would he have a sympathetic nervous system response? Yes, enough to get him through the situation. Would he probably lose bladder control, right? No, probably not. Does that make sense? So your sympathetic nervous system is really turning on and off all the time. It turns on just like if you need to walk to your car, right? It's just like, hey, I need a little boost. It'll definitely turn on the next time you're on I-15 and somebody almost kills you, right? So if you want to think about what the sympathetic nervous system does, your heart rate will go up, your pupils will dilate, your respiration will increase, right? All of that stuff will happen. Have you ever noticed that your mouth gets really dry? Yeah. Why does your mouth get really dry? Because that's not helpful. So it shuts down glandular function, right? Go ahead.
So, loss of bladder control, is that because your parasympathetic doesn't think that that's important?
So you have two things that go on. Your internal urethral sphincter is the smooth muscle one that's like right under your bladder. And that one should be actively contracted. So what can happen in the situation in which this occurs is that you can say, oh, I don't want to spend energy on that, and it opens up a little bit. But then in addition, you're also right now actively, consciously controlling your external urethral sphincter, that skeletal muscle. And when somebody tries to hold a gun on you, you're like, oh, I have so many things to worry about that I'm just going to dribble a little bit. But that's not directly related to this. It's related more like to voluntary control of, right? Does that make sense? Same reason your dog does it when he's really excited to see you. He's like, oh, hi, squirt. So it doesn't have to be bad, okay? So do you kind of understand at least the beginning of the story? This is definitely not all of the story, and we're going to get more of it later. Okay, so sympathetic and parasympathetic. What is generally happening over the course of the day, although we present these as fight or flight and feed or breed, it's really that you use them intermittently over the course of any day. To make you understand how to predict when would be used, we say that fight or flight and feed or breed. But like I said, when you get up and walk to your car, you're going to trigger this one just a little bit to get a little bit more cardiac muscle activity, right? And then as soon as you sit down and drive for 30 minutes, you're going to trigger the other one. So you're really just like kind of tweaking them over the course of the day. Everybody good? Okay, questions? Anyone? No? Okay, so this terminology that you're seeing right there, the faster you master that, the better, the more comfortable you will be for the rest of the semester. Because can you see that we're going to end up talking about it again whenever we talk, for instance, about cardiac muscle contraction, right? We're going to end up talking about it about all other body systems because, of course, the nervous system wires up to all other body systems. And so if you can get it sort of comfortable and out of the way, you'll be a lot better off. Good? Okay, so the next portion that we're going to do is just to talk about nervous tissue. And we're going to start to use the pharynx words again, but we're going to use them with reference to individual neurons instead of just a whole nervous system stuff. So let's talk about nervous tissue in a big picture real quick. Okay, so a big picture of nervous tissue is that, for instance, when you look at a lot of nervous tissue, you are going to have neurons, yes, and glial cells, right? So the neurons are the stars of the show. They are the ones that get a boatload of attention because they are responsible for the reason that you're smart or not so smart, the reason that you're crazy or not so crazy, right? Or maybe you're one of those few people, I've only met like 2 in my life and I didn't want to hang out with them, who are incredibly well adjusted. You know people like that? I don't know anybody else like that. Can't be friends with them. They make me feel bad about myself. So these are neurons, right? They release neurotransmitters. They are electrically active. They get boatloads of money and research. These are their little support staff, which are glial cells or neuroglial cells. And we're going to go through like functionality of all of these. So let's talk about neurons really quickly, and then we'll get into them in more detail, and we'll talk about glial cells as well. So one of the characteristics of neurons that ends up being really important both in A and in P is that they're really, really energetically expensive cells. They have a really, really high metabolic rate, meaning they gobble up oxygen and nutrients just faster than any other tissue in the body. The only one that's close to that is skeletal muscle. In addition, they're really particular. So in addition to needing boatloads of nutrients, they're really picky eaters. They prefer glucose above all other things. If you try to get them to switch to another nutrient, like another sugar, like burning fats, like burning proteins, like other tissues in the body that can do, they will be pissed off. And it's not as if they can't do it, because if you are starving, they will definitely switch nutrients, but they will let you know how unhappy they are. If this doesn't make any sense, has any of you guys ever tried our super high protein, low carb diet? Anybody ever tried one? Yeah? Did anybody try the ketogenic diet? Okay, so let's talk about what happens with this. You can force your neurons to move to burning another nutrient. They will be really pissed off when you try to get them to do it. You guys have probably experienced what your neurons do when you try to get them to switch or don't provide them with adequate levels of glucose, just when you're really hungry. Have you ever just gotten so hungry that you're like dumb as a stick and can't work with a doorknob? I mean, you're also like super pissed off, right? You're like, smack the doorknob because it won't work the way you expected it to, right? So that is an indication that your glucose levels are really low and your neurons are not happy about your glucose level being really low. If you do one of those low carb diets, then what you're going to do is you're going to force them to deal with that and to switch their favorite nutrient. With the ketogenic diet, you make them switch over to burning something primarily related to fats called ketones. Do you mind sharing what happened to your thought processes during the switch process?
I've done it a couple of times. So the first time, there's definitely brain fog for about a week.
Yeah.
Where you just feel like you're exhausted, you're tired,
And you feel stupid.
lethargic.
Yeah.
But the second time I knew that was an indicator, so I fed my body other things.
Yeah.
So and I didn't get it.
Yeah, and also you make more enzymes, interestingly. With the ketogenic diet, you can force your body to like burn fats, but you need to increase the number of enzymes that are necessary for doing that. And so a lot of times you'll get better at it the second time. Ketogenic diet has been really, really popular. It's really, really high fat, super low carb, middle level of protein. It's not good for all of us. FYI. It's pretty hard on your liver. It's pretty hard on your kidneys. And if you have a predisposition to high cholesterol, you sure as hell don't want to do it. My husband and I both tried it, but because I'm a scientist, I went and had our cholesterol levels checked before we did it, and then after for 2 months. And interestingly, just genetic variation, my cholesterol level was totally fine afterward. His was through the roof to the point that his doctor told him, you need to go off that diet, and if you come back in a month and your cholesterol level is this high, you're going to go on medication. So it is ridiculous amounts of fat, like to the point that you like think, oh, butter and bacon is going to be super pleasant, and then you're like, oh my God, this is repulsive. How could I possibly eat this much? You're like having to like put coconut oil on stuff just to like get enough fat. So the other one is Atkins. A lot of people have done the low-carb Atkins high-protein diet. And really, you're just forcing your neurons to switch over to another nutrient. They will let you know that they're unhappy about it in the first part. They can also readjust. By the way, the ketogenic diet was not developed as a weight loss. It was actually developed for epileptics. Yeah, it was actually one of the few diets that was actually developed based on biochemistry, and it's still used to manage epilepsy. One of the many interventions that you can use to manage epilepsy. Do we still, what? Yeah, insulin resistance. It's good for type 2 diabetes as well. Do we know why it decreases the frequency of seizures? And no idea.
What about like synthetic ketones? So like, you have ketogenic diet,
Yeah.
you eat high fat, and all that stuff. But what about like supplements?
Taking in ketone supplements. They think that taking in ketone supplements, especially when you're trying to get over the ketogenic portion, the fog, it can kind of help you. But they're not artificial. They're just like not from breaking down fats. You're just like skipping a couple of the steps. Because in phys, we actually learn how you make ketones out of fatty acids and that kind of stuff. You're just skipping a couple steps and taking in ketones instead of taking in fatty acids. Anyway, the point about this is that your brain prefers glucose above all other things. And it will let you know when you are not giving it adequate levels of glucose. You can switch it over. And the reason you can switch it over is because, do you think your body would just, in a situation in which you couldn't eat, decide it was a good run, let's just die? No, it will start eating you. It will start eating your own fat, right? Because it'll work in a pinch. It'll start eating your own proteins because you'll work in a pinch, right? And so your brain can switch over. Your brain, however, cannot do with low levels of oxygen. So what happens to your brain when you don't give it adequate levels of oxygen? Any idea? Well, first thing is it'll make you lay the hell down so that you can get more oxygen to your brain without battling with gravity. So you can pass out. And then if it's still too low, you will probably have a stroke. Yes? And the damage is permanent. If you cut off oxygen to these really, really energetically expensive cells, they will die and then you don't get them back. So this is... you really don't have much wiggle room with the amount of oxygen that goes to your brain. Go ahead, boss.
So nobody has that one heart effect where you have to hold between two people. Is he at a higher risk of stroke?
Yes, he is. They didn't decide to fix it as an adult? No? It must be pretty minor.
Yeah, they, well, he found out about it late because he started passing out.
Yeah.
Like, what's wrong with you? And he finally gets checked out and he has, I forget what it's called, but he basically just gets the oxygenated blood.
Yeah, it's a patent ductus arteriosus, or a patent foramen ovale. That's what it is, patent foramen ovale between the two. So you should have a good separation between the high oxygen blood and the low oxygen blood in your heart, right? And if you don't have a good separation, then you get the mixed blood. If you ever like really exert yourself, you can actually have a little trouble with blood going adequately to your brain. But instead of letting you have a stroke, your body will just make you lay down, which is passing out. I have the same predisposition for a different reason. I have a valve defect because I had scarlet fever when I was a kid. One of my valves is damaged, so I get a little backflow of blood, right? And so that valvular damage in combination with another thing that goes on my heart, sometimes I pass out. It's happened in class before, but probably not this semester. But just so you know, I'll probably live fine. Okay. So very high metabolic rate require constant supply of oxygen and glucose. Special things about neurons. Neurons are the only cells that can cause an electrical stimulus on another cell because they can release neurotransmitters. They also can receive any kind of stimulus and convert it into what we call an action potential. And if you don't know what an action potential is, blah, blah, blah. For those of you who are in physiology, we're talking about an electrical stimulation that goes down an axon. For those of you who haven't had physiology left, it's complicated, but it's just basically getting a really, really fast electrical stimulus to go down an axon. So this is called excitability or irritability, and they also have conductivity. And of course, one of the things that's really important for all of us who either could get pregnant or could cause a pregnancy is to know that you get one shot at putting together a nervous system. One shot. Because you pretty much make all of the neurons that are ever going to exist in the adult human during fetal development. That means that maternal care during fetal development is critical, right? Because any damage that occurs during fetal development is permanent damage to the nervous system. Does that make sense? So that means if you decided you were going to do crack, do not do it then, right? I mean, do not do it, but especially do not do it then, right? Does that make sense? So, and in addition, if you are trying to be a male who supports a healthy pregnancy, then you need to give her what the hell she needs right then. You make sure that she's taking care of herself. If she decides to do crack, you do not do it with her. That is terrible. So they are amitotic after fetal development. That means they have to live as long as a person lives. And I think the oldest person was 123 or something. I can't remember if that's numbers exactly right. That sounds so depressing to me. Every time I say 123, I know it probably should sound good, but I'm like, who the hell would you hang out with? Nobody. I know. All your friends and their children and their grandchildren are all dead. And you're just hanging around going, dude, what's up? Okay. So last little tidbit before you guys leave is this. So I want to talk a little bit about what neurons do. So this is trying to put together the idea of a neuron with that terminology that we used before, okay? So you said a nerve. So let's talk about what a nerve can be. This nerve, let's talk about the sciatic nerve again. So where are you, sciatic nerve? So this is your sciatic nerve right here, okay? This sciatic nerve is likely to be doing sensation from your little toe, yes? Motor information to your little toe. So that nerve is mixed in function. The nerve is doing both, right? In your head, you have some nerves that are so busy doing sensation that that's all they do, like the optic nerve, right? So you had to farm out the other activity to the motor nerves that move your eyes around, okay? So a nerve, right, a bundle of axons can be sensory, can be motor, or can be mixed, yes? Because it's a bunch of different axons, right? But a neuron cannot be mixed. So let's look at what neurons are doing. Okay, so look here. So this is showing you a situation in which she got an itch and scratched it, okay? And I want to look at 3 different neurons and talk about what they are doing. The first neuron, the blue one. It's a weird looking neuron. Don't worry about why it looks weird yet. I'll explain that to you next time. This neuron is, can we agree, doing sensation? Yeah? What kind of sensation? Put some words together with it. Somatic sensation, because it's coming from where? Skin, okay? So this neuron is exclusively carrying information that way, okay? Let's skip that one for just a second. This neuron is doing what? Motor? Yeah? Or what afferent? Efferent. Be specific. What kind of motor activity is it controlling? Somatic motor. Good, right? Each neuron is committed to its function. It's never going to do 2 things, okay? Now, what is this neuron doing? This neuron is not mixed in function. It's doing this part, integration. Yes? Does that make sense to you? So that neuron is doing integration. So information in is sensation. Information processed is integration. Information out is motor activity. Yes? Does that make sense? So a single neuron can be sensory, motor, or it can be what we call an interneuron, and they're called interneurons because they're between neurons. Good? But a single neuron cannot have mixed in function. Cannot have mixed function. Is that true for a nerve? A nerve can be sensory, it can be motor, or it could be mixed in function. But a neuron can be sensory, it can be motor, or it can be an interneuron, but not mixed in function. Does that make sense? Okay, so with this picture right here, goes back to Alice's question that she had before. This picture is showing something going straight through the spinal cord and not going to the conscious portion of the brain. Can you see that this might be a reflex, Alice, instead of actually a conscious response? So something tickled her and she's just like, that's a reflex. If it was going all the way up to the cerebral cortex and you thought, hey, that itches, maybe I should scratch it. And it's going to be really slow and I hope it wasn't a spider. right? Does that make sense? So, sensory neuron, motor neuron, or interneuron. Good? Okay, so can you kind of see how people get really, really confused about nerves versus neurons? Okay, go ahead.
The interneuron is responsible for the integration.
Yes. But let's think about this. How many interneurons would there be if, for instance, we did this sensory response? I look at that and I think that looks like a delicious frothy coffee, right? I think that maybe I should drink it, even though I'm pretty sure it has 750 calories. What happens is the information goes in. How much processing is going on? Am I going to go through one interneuron? A boatload of them, right? Before I decide, yes, the motor response that I have out, right? So when you are doing something that is a conscious or voluntary decision, then the whole process goes through way the hell more interneurons than one. That's like the simplest picture that you could put. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, got it? So the integration can be really, really simple with a reflex, really, really complex, like with intellectual decision making. How the hell do you look at a calculus problem and figure out what the answer is? You don't just send it through one interneuron, do you? You send it through all of them, including the portions that make you want to cry, before you actually do the information out, right? Any of you guys really good at calculus? Good, I'm glad. I have had 3 calculus courses, and I have to tell you, it's very humbling because I still don't know what calculus is for. I'm like, I can pass this class, but I don't